My name is Mark Ritchie. I have the honor of serving as president of Global Minnesota. And we're partnering with so many wonderful people. I want you to know that tonight's program, and actually a whole week of activities that we've been engaged in looking at this very important U.S. and Japanese relationship and our alliance. We're partnered with the World Affairs Council of America. Global Minnesota functions as the World Affairs Council here, but there's about 90 of us, cousins around the country, and Liz Brailsford from the office in Washington, the Chief Operating Officer, will be moderating the program this evening. Was a former Minnesotan. I guess you're always a Minnesotan, so Liz will be part of the process. But the World Affairs Council, an important partner. The Minnesota Trade Office, an important partner for us in many things in our program this evening. JASM, the Japanese America Society of Minnesota, a very important organization that helps bridge our cultures and our societies and help lift our awareness and our participation and engagement, has been a really important partner for our work. The Sasakawa Peace Foundation of Washington has been our main partner in the creation of this program, in this activity for the week. We'll be hearing also from one of the key leaders from Sasakawa Peace Foundation, Admiral Blair. But we also have partners with the East-West Center. And Dr. Limaye is one of the respondents this evening. We had an amazing presentation from Dr. Limaye at our noon program over in St. Paul. The East-West Center really is created to help expand our understanding and our relationships between the United States and Asia, and you'll be hearing about that as part of the panel. But Admiral Blair's had a life of leading our nation in our national security, battle fleets in the Asia and the Pacific, and service in many different parts, bringing him to a very senior level inside of our U.S. Navy. He also was the National Intelligence Director, leading all of those agencies, $50 billion budget, trying to find the ways that we make our nation secure, but also that we think into the future in our relationships. He's played a number of roles at the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, including president and chair. He's now a senior fellow, but he's one of the key people in helping bring a message about how our U.S.-Japan Alliance is critical to both nurture, to keep in mind, but also to think forward. And I want to welcome Admiral Blair and ask you to join me in welcoming here to our evening this night.
Well, thanks very much, Mark, for that warm introduction. This is my first visit to the Twin Cities, so happy to be here. The son of a Navy officer, I spent my time in the Navy in the entire center of the United States was either a 4-hour plane ride or an 8-day family station wagon trip. And so it's nice to be able to be here and to meet some of you all. And already in the events that I've been able to take part in so far, finding lots of connections and common things. So I'm really glad to be here. The U.S.-Japan relationship is really a complex and unique one, and it has a number of moving parts. Just to start with, of course, there's the history. We fought this ferocious war from 1941 through 1945. It began with a sneak attack by Japan on the U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor on what President Roosevelt called a day that will live in infamy. And then it ended with the United States dropping 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And yet, while neither country has forgotten that history, they've really placed it in a context and have made the relationship one that takes care of the present and looks to the future in a pretty remarkable way when you go back to the history of what happened in those early years in the 40s. It's worked, however, that doesn't end. It was as recently as 2015 that President Obama was the first American president to visit Hiroshima, and a few months later, Prime Minister Abe came and made a visit to Pearl Harbor. So there are a lot of legacy history problems around the world. There are many in Asia. And I think the way the United States and Japan have worked on ours, not forgetting but not being shackled by them, has been pretty important. There's the mutual cultural attraction, of course. Americans for generations have been drawn to Japan by its unique art, craftsmanship, and in more recent years, the younger generation by manga, anime, and Mario. And the Japanese, for their part, have flocked to the United States as a tourist destination. They've consumed American culture in many ways, American popular music and so on. And the third aspect of the relationship that many of us are very aware of is the economic and business relationships. It was American purchases of both goods and services during the Korean War that really gave Japan the first start to take its war-devastated economy and built it into the economic juggernaut that it became in the 1970s and 1980s, when inexpensive but well-built Japanese cars, Japanese consumer electronics flooded the United States. And if we're honest, it forced the United States to raise our own game in terms of manufacturing in order to compete. And now, of course, many Japanese cars are made in this country. Even now, we are engaged in a trade negotiation with Japan, and so this business relationship, commercial relationship, economic relationship continues to evolve and to be important. And then fourth, which I'm going to talk about at some detail, there's the U.S.-Japan defense relationship. Now, from the Cold War, in the Cold War years, from about 1945 through roughly 1990, it was a very unequal relationship. Japan, for its part, maintained an advanced but very small and very limited self-defense force. Its mission was defending Japan, I mean literally the soil, the very close by waters and the airspace of Japan. And Japan hosted an extensive set of military bases that were used by U.S. forces, naval, air. So Japan on its side provided basing for American forces, and the United States pledged to defend Japan in case of direct attack, and also provided a nuclear umbrella to deter nuclear threats. And then the United States used those bases in Japan to deploy our military forces around the region and, in fact, around the world in crisis and conflict. And the policy aspects of this relationship were also very unbalanced. It was always the United States that set the policies. Japan seldom took the initiative. Japan mainly reacted to American ideas, sometimes grudgingly, sometimes wholeheartedly, but it was sort of a one-way flow of that policy decision-making. Now, this arrangement worked, I suppose, well enough until the Soviet Union collapsed, but then China began to develop a serious military capability from about 2000 on. North Korea developed its nuclear weapons and built a missile force that could in fact deliver them into Japan, whether at Japanese targets or at U.S. bases. And so this new security environment put quite different demands on the U.S.-Japan security relationship. And as it had in the past, the security relationship adapted. Japan increased its spending on its self-defense forces, and it lifted many of the former restraints on the missions that its forces could accomplish. For example, Japanese maritime self-defense force ships can now operate with U.S. Navy ships in combined battle groups against common threats, and this was not routine in the past when I was a commander of a destroyer in Japan. And in the past, as I mentioned, while it was always the U.S. that took the lead in regional crisis or conflict, with the Japanese self-defense force back in the rear, defending home water, home territory, home airspace. Now, for example, in the event of a Chinese threat against the Senkaku Islands, which are claimed by both China and by Japan, it is Japanese forces that are in the lead, with the U.S. forces acting in support. And this puts quite a different and much more equal dynamic into our defense relationship. Last year, for example, the bilateral defense guidelines, which are really the primary policy document about how the United States and Japan will handle their defense relationships, that was revised. And in that revision, it was Japan that was presenting the ideas, taking the lead, playing a more equal part, quite different from the arrangement in past years. Although they've not deployed extensively, Japan self-defense forces now have the authority to take an active role in peacekeeping operations, which again was not possible under their previous interpretation of their constitution. Now, there's a test case going on right now of whether these new Japanese authorities and new Japanese thinking will play out in terms of actual action, and that has to do with the attacks by Iran on shipping in the going through the Strait of Hormuz from the Persian Gulf out into the Indian Ocean, and Japanese oil tankers have been attacked. The United States is in the process of putting together a group to defend shipping that goes through that narrow strait. Countries that will contribute forces and to defending that shipping. And in the past, that would have simply been out of the question for Japan. Their interpretation of their defense mandate was very much close to home. Now, the Japanese government is considering this as actively, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if they did, in fact, join the coalition, adding their very capable maritime self-defense forces to those of the United States and the other countries that will join. If that did, and I urge you to watch that space, it would truly be an epic development in Japanese defensive thinking. It would be the first time that they have assigned forces to protect a very vital interest, the flow of oil on which Japan completely depends, with their military forces, something they have not done before, something they did not do in the 1980s when Japanese tankers were attacked by both Iraq and Iran. So watch to see how that develops, and I think it would really be an important indicator. Japan had taken a small step along the way in the same region previously by joining the international naval coalition that was suppressing Somali-based pirates against shipping in that part of the world. But dealing with pirates is one thing, dealing with Iranian advanced forces is another. So I would argue that this evolution in Japanese, their defense budget, their relationship with the United States has really made Japan into the single most important ally of the United States, the single most important ally of the United States in the world. We used to talk about NATO as our most important ally, biggest, faced up against the most important enemy at that time, the Soviet Union. NATO has turned from a special into an a la carte menu. The 22 nations that are now part of it decide whether they're going to join in one cause. Maybe they won't, maybe they will. So you really can't talk about NATO as a single coherent military ally of the United States. Japan, on the other hand, is a single ally that's located in the economic center of the world. That's where most of the world GDP is being generated. These days, it's potentially the most dangerous, as I mentioned, with a growing and more assertive China, a mischief-making North Korea, and it has a set of stubborn legacy territorial disputes that could act as flashpoints and boil into crisis and have at times in the past. So Japan is our strongest ally in this most important region of the world. It's aligned with us on fundamental values of free people, free markets. It has a shared vision of what the future of Asia should be, and it has a shared awareness of the challenges that both China and North Korea pose to achieving that vision. So in my time in the armed forces and later in other positions, I've seen the U.S.-Japan relationship evolving in a very positive direction, and it now is at a very strong point. But where does it go in the future? I did talk about progress, but there is still a lot to be done. At the tactical level, ship-to-ship, airplane-to-airplane, the United States and Japanese forces operate together very, very well. They especially operate together on a service-to-service basis. Japanese buy a lot of equipment from the United States. It's interoperable with the equipment on our own ships and aircraft, and we do it very well. However, military operations, especially in the air maritime island theater of East Asia, involve a lot more than just separate Navy operations, separate Air Force operations, separate Marine Corps Army operations. They have to be done as an integrated force, a joint force in the case of the United States, a combined force in the case of the United States and Japan. And you put on top of that new areas that are much more important to warfare in the past, cyber operations, space operations. It becomes an incredibly complex and integrated set of warfighting skills and disciplines that have to be welded together. And the United States and Japan are still at the early stages of working out the command and control arrangements, the doctrine, the exercise program to shake problems out, for them to be fully effective in these sorts of 21st century operations. Now, the other big alliance that we have in that part of the world, with the Republic of Korea, there's actually a combined military structure. In time of conflict, the Korean and the American forces form together into one command that has an American general in charge, a Korean general as the deputy, and they operate together. So they have a natural way to work out some of these coordination, jointness, and integration problems. It makes it relatively straightforward to work out these concepts and build these skills, even though it's difficult. It's more complex for the United States and Japan. We face together a number of contingencies that are more numerous, that are more complex, and the command relationships will be more fluid. If a contingency happens down in the South China Sea, it'll be somewhat different from one happening around Taiwan, from one happening around the Senkaku Islands, from one happening up in the Korean Peninsula. So it requires a degree of flexibility, which is important, but underneath that flexibility, you have to have good, solid ability to work together across multiple domains, and we need to work that out in the relationship. The more we, this process sounds like I'm talking about getting ready for war, but I'm actually talking about building a greater combined U.S.-Japanese capability in order to keep war from happening. My experience in the Pacific is if the United States and our allies make it very unattractive for a country that wants to use military force to carry out its goals, those countries will seek other means to do it, and that's really our job in that part of the world. So I don't want to give you the impression or the idea that I think war in the East Asia is imminent. I don't think it is. However, one of the essential factors in the economic and political miracle that's taken place in East Asia over the last 34 years, since the end of World War II, has been the American security guarantees in the region that was underpinned by a healthy margin of U.S. military superiority. In the new era, that U.S. margin needs to be a U.S.-Japanese, and I would argue U.S.-Japanese-Korean margin, that the countries that think alike, that have the same vision for that area, can make sure that aggression by authoritarian countries who want to change the landscape out there is a quite unattractive option. They ought to go back home and think about other things. And that's really our job, and to do that, we have to continue to develop this U.S.-Japan relationship. And if we can, and I think we can, I think we have every prospect of doing that, then continued peace and prosperity will exist in that part of the world, and the U.S.-Japan Alliance will have been, as it has been in the past, a very important part of that. So once again, it's a pleasure to be here with you in Minneapolis with a large number of people who care about international issues, which is extremely important. I look very much forward to our discussion, your questions, and the rest of the evening. Thanks very much.
Okay. All right. Well, good evening. Thank you for coming. The United States must recognize once again and permanently that the power constellation in Asia is of everlasting concern to her, both in time of war and in time of peace. That was Nikolas Speakman, a Dutch-American strategist and Yale professor. in his book, The Geography of the Peace, which came out in 1944, the year after he died. He predicted in 1942 that the U.S. and Japan would be allies, that we needed to form an alliance, and that that would counteract China, which would become all-powerful and an overwhelming presence in what he called the Asiatic Mediterranean. Keep in mind that this was during World War II, when the U.S. and Japan were at war, and China was a critical U.S. ally. These statements were inconceivable at the time. Mighty prescient, one might say. So we're in an interesting time here in Asia these days, which you touched on a few of these, Admiral. Perhaps seeing more instability than we've ever seen in the region. And you've mentioned a few of these, but there's the U.S. withdrawal from the TPP in early 2017. There's the U.S.-China trade war, the concerning development of the Japan-South Korea conflict, the North Korean short-range missile launches, which Trump said no big deal, and the U.S.-North Korea summits. China's Belt and Road Initiative, which started in officially 2013, Hong Kong protests, Russia's geopolitical posturing and conflict, and the ongoing island disputes, which you mentioned, just to say a few. So in terms of U.S. and Japan specifically, our alliance, which you said is arguably, well, you said it was the most important ally. Japan is our most important ally, and I believe that also. I think it's arguably the most important alliance in the world. It's remained so strong, as Ambassador Zumwalt earlier today said, because of our shared interests and our shared values. And it's undergirded the Asia-Pacific region for around 7 decades. Our two countries make up 30% of the global economy. We have an unprecedented relationship these days. President Trump and Prime Minister Abe have seen face-to-face 15 times each other and have had 30-something phone calls. However, our alliance is shifting to a more balanced relationship, with Japan taking on more responsibility, both fiscally and militarily, which I want to hear from you in a moment about that more. But before we do that, Satu, to kick us off, can you talk a little bit more about the evolving U.S.-Japan Alliance, and how strong are our ties given these changes, these challenges, and how does it affect us here in the United States?
Well, those are a lot of questions. So I'll try to do my best. But first of all, let me start by thanking all of you for taking the time on a weeknight to be here. A really great show of strength, of interest in our country's relations with the rest of the world, which is what my organization does in the Indo-Pacific space. We were established by Congress to promote collaborative education exchange. Little closer. My organization, the East-West Center, was established by the Congress to promote education exchange and research collaboratively to advance U.S.-Asia relations. And so I'm very pleased to see the great turnout of interest, and I'm delighted to partner with the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. And thank you, World Affairs Council, and of course, Global Minnesota, our hosts here in Minnesota. Let me start by saying a couple things that, from my perspective, are really critical about the U.S.-Japan relationship. One, it is my view that Americans have, in recent decades, not purposely or in any way, just because of the way the world has changed since the end of the Cold War, has underweighted the importance of the U.S.-Japan relationship in our public discourse. I think Japan has underplayed its role, evolving role, is point one. Second point I'd make is the U.S.-Japan relationship, unlike during the Cold War or post-1945 era, is not only the most important alliance, I completely agree with the Admiral, but more importantly, is even more important given the fluidity and the change in the Asia-Pacific region. In some ways, it's ironic The relative importance of the U.S.-Japan relationship, the relative importance, has declined as China has risen, Korea has achieved OECD status, India has risen, much of Southeast Asia has risen, etc. On the other hand, precisely because of the change of these other powers, and particularly the rise of China, the alliance with Japan becomes very important. So we must now see this alliance structurally not only to maintain global institutions, norms, rules, which we can come to on TPP and other issues, but also for shaping the future of the Indo-Pacific region. Second, you asked me about the importance. Working with the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, we've produced a report called Japan Matters for America, America Matters for Japan. I believe there are copies outside. I'm not going to bore you with all the details, but just to say this. There is no relationship we have with anyone, NATO countries, Western countries included, that is systematically and structurally more important on all variables of relations. What do I mean by variables of relations? That sounds very wonky. Trade, investment, students, tourism, jobs, foreign direct investment, technology collaboration, military sales, exercises, integration, working on rules, norms, and institutions, whether it be the WTO, the UN, East Asia Summit, whatever you want to pick, and it's all detailed here on the interactive website, for every U.S. state and congressional district. And the same is true conversely. Every prefecture in Japan has an interest and stake in the relationship with the United States. So this relationship for our two countries is extraordinarily deep. It is a combination, as the Admiral said, of remembrance and reconciliation, but we can't afford complacency. There's a lot of work to do. So let me end on that note.
And I think that our relationship is even critical to preserving those institutions that you just mentioned. Admiral, can you talk more about the shifting relationship through the lens of military, how it's becoming more balanced? Japan is picking up more responsibility in terms of the military and financial means.
I think it's an important question that has been raised by this administration, and in particular this president. He's asking good questions about, okay, are our relationships with our important allies mutually beneficial to the extent that they should be, or is the burden being, is there a difference in burden and responsibility? I think in the case of Japan, a little bit of the history is important. The reason Japan has very limited self-defense forces of its own is because its constitution, which was written by a group of Americans in 1947, says that it shouldn't have any armed forces at all. And as I mentioned in my remarks, the U.S. has very much been out in the lead doing the work, and was quite happy to have Japan just supplying bases in a very small role. That being said, this is not a new issue in U.S.-Japan relations, particularly back in the 70s and 80s when Godzilla Japan was devouring the United States economically. The question came up, and about that time, Japan began contributing financial resources to the cost of maintaining U.S. forces in its country, and those amount to $4 to $5 billion right now. So these adjustments have been made, as I mentioned, at a time when the United States was dropping our defense budget, which is a higher percentage of our GDP than is Japan's. But at that time, when we were bringing it down, Japan was steadily bringing it up. So I think the trends in the relationship in terms of burden sharing and who is carrying the load are good. I do agree with that we need to keep looking at that, keep the pressure on so that it is not only is, but is seen to be an equal relationship in which equal contributions are reaping equal benefits. So I think we're headed in the right direction.
And you mentioned a little while ago, too, about the Guam base that we're moving forward with. Is that official, or do you have any other comments on that and Japan contributing to that?
Well, yeah, that is part of it. As part of a plan to reduce the number of Marines who are actually physically stationed in Japan, Japan is providing the funding for building both the logistics and the training areas for those Marines to operating in Guam. So that's one more factor in sharing the load and shifting the burden. And that's in process. It's slower than many of us would like it to be, but it's again headed in the right direction.
I'd like you both to comment on this, and if there are questions that come up that you think of to ask each other, please feel free during this. But what is the current role in practical terms that our alliance serves in the region? And either one.
I'll start with a couple of ideas. There are areas in which Japan has strength, and the area in which the United States has strengths. Southeast Asia, which Dr. Limaye knows better than I do, is an area in which the United States generally goes around tying most of our programs to performance measures and political concerns, which are good. In the case of Burma, Myanmar, for example, the United States has gradually eased the sanctions that we imposed on Burma for its military regime, and we look at the policies of a country and we meter our aid. Japan's approach is more to play for the long term, and they will try to build institutions within countries like Myanmar with less of a lecturing, hectoring approach and more looking to long-term results. Now, there are disadvantages to both, right? If you're just in the face of a country all the time, they will generally say, "Why do I need your help anyway? I'd rather I'll do it on my own." If you just provide aid with no conditionality, with no exercise, then you'll be taken advantage of. But this combination of approaches by the United States and Japan to many of the countries in the region, which are sort of on the fence as to which way they'd go, has been fairly effective. On the military areas, the United States really takes the lead. But for instance, in the South China Sea, a heavily contested area these days, Japan is providing lots of support to Coast Guard forces, to maritime surveillance systems for the country that complements the United States, which sails its ships and airplanes through there in order to assert the sovereignty. So in many cases, the skills go together.
Yeah, there's a lot that the U.S. and Japan can do in the region together. Let me just note a couple things. It was really kind of Japan that intellectually came up with the idea of the free and open Indo-Pacific. There's a very famous speech by Prime Minister Abe in 2007, as it happened in the Indian Parliament, called "The Confluence of the Two Seas," in which he connected the two theaters of Indian Ocean and the Pacific. So as you can see, Japan's geographic vision, in a way, started a little bit before in terms of connecting this maritime space, and a lot of that reflected concern about China. And at around the same time, Prime Minister Abe made a speech about the security diamond, and we talked about linking the United States, Japan, India, and Australia, which has since evolved into not a military organization of any kind, but a consultation, diplomatic, exercise platform called, sometimes in the literature, it's called the Quad, because it includes these four countries of U.S., Japan, Australia, India. So the second kind of thing that the U.S. Japan Alliance does is knit together partnerships and alliances in the region. Third, the Admiral spoke very well already about capacity building. I'll only say that the Japanese have created a capacity building office in their Ministry of Defense. It's comparatively small to our security assistance program, but not insignificant because it leverages comparative advantages, for example, the provision of patrol boats for maritime security and observation and surveillance, as well as training elements. So there's a tie-in. And then finally, in terms of its proactive thing, the one thing I really point to is, though we rejected the TPP for now, Japan went ahead with the other 10 countries, 11 minus the U.S., which would have made 12, to create something called the CPTPP. International relations is very poor at marketing. We need better marketing in our work. But anyways, terrible acronym, but really meaningful project, which is essentially to keep the key elements of the high standards TPP agreement without the United States, not abrogate those tough chapters on intellectual property and other elements of economic. And what's really important is that it builds a platform on which either the U.S. or other countries in the region could eventually join or, put it another way, dock on. And I think this is really important. These are all elements of how the alliance, both in its military manifestations, diplomatic manifestations, its economic cooperation, can help build a kind of an integrated Indo-Pacific picture that serves both our countries' interests, and I personally think the stability and prosperity of the region.
If I could add one more thought on this mind, Liz. When I look at sort of take a step back from the East Asian region, we have the United States, the biggest economy in the world, China, number 2, Japan, number 3. All 3 of those countries are facing enormous challenges right now. China, although from the outside it looks like a juggernaut that is going to grow at 10% forever, it's not. In fact, the latest industrial figures were down around 4%, and that's probably inflated. All of the problems of an aging population, the result of the one-child policy in the past that can't be corrected immediately, the corruption, the pollution, its financial debt that it's dealing with, and so on. It has a very formidable set of problems if it is going to continue the kind of growth which has underpinned its both its military spending and its sort of attractiveness as a model. Japan faces a tremendous aging population. The population of Japan is in fact shrinking right now. It's not just that the rate of increase is diminished; it's actually going down. Japanese immobility of labor, their immigration policies, which are not bringing in workers for jobs that are going unfilled. A lot of the mobility of labor in the country needs to be fixed. These things that were part of Abenomics, which was the economic policies that Prime Minister Abe brought in, which have made some difference, but haven't really turned things around as dramatically as he hoped. Those are all faced by Japan, and of course, all of us are familiar with the problems we have here in the United States, with federal government dysfunction being at the top of the list, running on down through needing to improve our education system, our infrastructure, the things that we have to do. To me, the way this competition turns out will be determined by which country can get on top of its own problems the fastest and the most effectively. Everything else will flow from that. You can't maintain a big, tough military over time with a lousy economy. You can't maintain attractiveness to other countries in the world, and in the region in particular, if your society is not producing both prosperity and a good way of life. So what I really try to watch is that the military aspect, which I talked about, can hold the ring. It can keep military aggression from being attractive, but the real result of this story will be determined by how each country deals with its own problems and which country can do it the best. Can it be countries which rely on the energy of its own people and the sort of free ideas and free marketplace, or is the Chinese authoritarian model in which everything is directed from the top going to come out on top? I think that's the big question of our age.
So China, let's segue into that now that you brought it up, and I think that's a really interesting perspective. Beyond the competition, how can our alliance counteract the encroaching China, the dominance that we've seen recently, to counteract the Belt and Road Initiative, and to piggyback on top of that, what type of triangular relationship are we looking for in the future? What's ideal for us? What is realistic? What are your thoughts, both of you, in either one of you?
Yeah, well, I'll start then. I think the problem with our approach towards China in the past was that we treated China as some sort of gangly growing adolescent that needed to be educated in the ways of the U.S. established system after the war, and that China, who benefited so much from the world free market system, would learn that they needed to play by the rules and become a contributing and supporting member of the set of trade, investment, political rules that were set up. Well, China listened to all of these lectures and then went ahead and did whatever it could get away with. And it said, I don't want to just pass some entrance to the club. I'd like to come in and be the owner and break up the crockery and be in charge of this thing. And they have chosen to take in full advantage of the system while not assuming the responsibilities for it. Now, that has produced a recognition and strong reaction by the United States. And I'd say the biggest change in important public opinion about East Asia is that far from having a lot of supporters in the United States, in the business community, in the academic community, and elsewhere, those communities are virtually united now in saying that we have to do something more sharper with China, that waiting around for them to improve and to become like us is not going to work. But it's a key time as to what will we do in order to turn that thought into positive action, because it's not like the Cold War days when the world is divided into two pieces. We are going to have a very rich economic relationship with China. So is Japan, and there are many political problems which we need to work on together, not being at odds. So it will require a very careful set of policies by the United States. But unlike the past, I think part of those policies have to be very sharp penalties when China is taking actions which run against American interests and established international norms, and exact a price for that rather than simply a lecture. And we have to find that balance and continuing working that way with China. And we're Americans. We sort of swing one way strongly, and then we swing the other way strongly. We have got to be, I think, pretty cool-eyed and hard-edged about this. I would say that the Japanese are probably thinking about it in more practical terms than we are right now, and they have no illusions about China's ambitions, but they, I think, are more practical right now in terms of ways to cooperate. And so I think, again, U.S.-Japan relationship in dealing with China, we can learn from each other, and we can come up with a way to handle this.
Yeah, I think, first of all, without a strong U.S.-Japan relationship, there is no way to handle China. Which leads to sort of a second point, which in the last 70 years has always struck me, is that some have argued, this is a very, very crude way of putting it, but some have argued, particularly, I shouldn't say over 70 years, last 20 years when China has really risen in power and military power, economic strength, diplomatic influence, that we have to get our alliances in the region and partnerships in the region right, because if we get those right, China, we can get China right, because China will see, as the Admiral spoke about, holding the ring with our military while we fix our internal societies to make us handle the larger stuff. So that's one approach. The other approach, historically, and I've just been reading a biography of Henry Luce, which makes me think about it, it was get China right. You got to get China policy right. China is the most important relationship. And if you get China right, you'll get the rest of Asia right. Here's the challenge I see. China has now become very important for all our allies and friends in the region and partners in the region. as well as important to us. So now we can't really think of getting allies right or China right. We have to get Asia right. So what does that mean? First, it means to me that we shore up our alliances and partnerships even more. That has to be the starting point of our engagement. That means Japan, means Korea, it means Australia, it means new partners like potentially Vietnam, potentially India, others. Second, China has, in my view, made a tremendous error in dealing with the U.S. It has alienated the business community through intellectual property theft. It has created a certain amount of lack of support through its very, in my view, harsh NGO law, which restricts access to society. And third, it's created a highly authoritarian system which is not particularly attractive to the West and certainly not the U.S. So you can see the public opinion polling about China has become more skeptical. In the region, what China has done is first using, and again, to refer to the Admiral's very great point about fixing our domestic house, getting our domestic house in order, use the 2008 financial crisis, I think, to make a huge miscalculation of assertiveness on the South China Sea and then later on the East China Sea by articulating historical claims and assertions of sovereignty that are not consistent with international law. And they lost a ruling in the Permanent Court of Arbitration regarding that. So they've alienated the region to some extent. But the region is the region. They will navigate. They will make sure they don't get into a scrape with China. So we can't go into this in a pure, obviously, we want to, the whole point is to avoid conflict. And I think the way we do that, my view, would be to increase our alliance and partnerships while looking for avenues of managing the China relationship. And right now, as I travel through the region, my sense is countries in the region want to work constructively with China. They want benefits of China. They don't want to be totally dependent on us, for example. But they are alarmed by some of the trends and tendencies. And they don't want to be a part of a hierarchical regional system from previous centuries.
So let's bring it home a little bit more. Japan is the fourth largest trading partner with Minnesota. Visitors from Japan spend nearly $300 million annually in the state. Japanese attending Minnesota's colleges contribute an estimated $6 million annually to the local economy. And Japan companies employ around 5,000 people in Minnesota. So the relationship is robust here at home. Satu, you talked a little bit earlier about Japan-Minnesota relationship, and can you talk a little bit more about that? And I was going to ask you about the under-the-radar thoughts that you have, and you went into that a little bit more. But if you have more comments on that, that's great. And just talk a little bit more about Minnesota, Japan.
Yeah, sure. In a way, this is a little awkward because you guys are the experts on the Japan-Minnesota relationship, not me. You've been educating me over the last 48 hours. I mean, I'm just, I grew up in Seattle. Japan was our neighbor. So it's like, as I always say, America goes to Asia by going west, right? And here I am, if you will, in the heartland and Midwest, and I'm just awestruck by the kind of connections. I mean, we did the research. Our team looked at all the data. We looked over timelines. We did the trends. We racked and stacked them against other states. And, I can go and bore you with numbers, but I'll forget them all. But, pork exports, soybeans, wheat, obviously beef, all kinds of things. You can talk about them. I don't think much wine yet from Minnesota, which is good because I want to have Washington State wine go out to Japan under this new deal, hopefully. But anyway, so here I am in Minnesota, and I learned that the largest collection of Japanese art and artifacts outside of Japan is at your museum. I learned that there are roughly, give or take, I don't know the number, several hundred people studying Japanese at your universities. I hear about these pork and beef export numbers, or soybeans, or what have you, or other agricultural products. And I think it's pretty healthy. Now, I talk to there's business community interactions, and we learn about mergers and acquisitions and capital investments and what have you. But I think all of that, again, I'm sort of, my mantra is sort of don't be complacent. There's a lot of competitive elements of this. There's a lot of restructuring going on in supply chains. There's a lot of uncertainty in the way that globalization and supply chains are going to develop. And so I asked this question the other day, is what next for Minnesota in terms of services, tourism, innovative education? I mean, I'm struck by the strength of the educational system here and the workforce development. Are there ways to capitalize on that? I don't know the answers. As I said, I'm raising questions and doing these analysis because you guys have a pretty strong delegation in Washington, and we want to talk to them about membership in the U.S. Japan Caucus, and we want to build support for those kinds of relationships across the country, because I think in an era that we're living in, where populism, where a certain, certainly not isolationist, but a certain inward look to fix our dysfunctions, as the Admiral said, it places more of a burden on us involved in this work to make the case why Japan and the U.S. Japan Alliance is part of the solution to our fixes. And so I'm looking forward to a continued engagement with friends and colleagues here on how we do that, because I don't have the answers.
You're the biggest Minnesota expert Washingtonian that I've ever met. So to change gears a little bit, there's been a lot of dialogue about the importance of grassroots diplomacy out there. And how can each of us play a part? And what part can that play in the U.S.-Japan relationship and in Minnesota-Japan relations?
I think one thing I've noticed is that in the United States political scene, Japan probably punches way under its weight compared to communities from other countries. I think it partly has to do with the Japanese culture that within Japan people don't stand out, don't make a lot of noise. You work hard and you're expected to be recognized, and there's a certain hierarchical structure, and it's particularly true. For example, just compare it to the neighbors right there, the Korean American community. They're out there putting up statues, tearing down statues, making noise and all, and I try to tell my Japanese friends that your approach works well in Japan, but this is a big, competitive, ugly, loud battle for influence that we have in this country, and you got to get in there and get a little dirty, and it's just not something that the Japanese do in their own country very well, or certainly within other countries. So I think that the Japan-American relation needs some help from Americans who understand it, and this is in fact is our job at Sasakawa USA, is to be white-faced Caucasian gaijins, advocates of this relationship. I mean, the figures that from just reading the paper, you'd think that the most important investor in the United States from Asia right now would be China, and it's not. Japan has been number one or number two with the UK for years, and China is now, Chinese foreign direct investment in the United States dropped 95% last year. So the facts of the common perception of Japan's importance, I don't think, are up to the reality of it. So I'd say one thing that informed citizens can do is simply make that point in places where it matters. It's very important to make it important in groups like we are tonight, but to sort of spread that word among other groups, to bring it up when you talk with when you talk in other fora, and just raise the awareness, because that is a big part of it.
Yeah, just a couple of quick points on that. I started out by saying, my own sense is that American discourse has underweighted the Japan relationship, and Japan has underplayed the Japan relationship, is how I put it. And I chose those words very carefully because I've been thinking about how to explain this up on the Hill, particularly when we do programs and outreach. And, it's quite interesting to me, and I also made the point that when we built the alliance post-45, if you looked at U.S. government stats, there were only 2 countries in the Asia-Pacific that we put Commerce Department, Bureau of Economic Analysis statistics, and those were Japan and Australia. And that ain't the world anymore in the Indo-Pacific. So it's not, as we, I would sort of echo the Admiral's point about mixing it up here, because Japan is no longer the only representative of the Indo-Pacific in America. China's opening has come. It's far below Japan on all of these vectors. People talk about trade, but trade is the most skewed and distorting and dangerous way of measuring relationships. I warn against it, because if you really look at supply chains and value added, much of the trade between U.S. and China, for example, has a heavy Japan component. So it's not really U.S.-China trade. Japan is very heavily engaged in that trade. What's really the test of things is long-term sustainable in foreign direct investment leading to good, high-paying workforce development jobs. And UK's been around 150 years investing in our country, but Japan is really number 2, but doing a lot and growing. So those are the kind of points that don't get brought up. The other thing is, when we talk about Japan, all the tourism relationships, the sister city relationships, people to people, they're pretty deep and structural, and they're not shared. But things don't stand still. I'm very conscious there are roughly 2.5 million Korean Americans. There's 3.5 million Indian Americans. We're about to sign a trade deal with India. It used to be an era when I was growing up that we only saw consumer products from Japan, right? Walkmans, maybe I date myself, but who cares at this point? Sony Walkman, CD players, Japanese cars, but that isn't the game anymore. Now people are growing up with Samsung, K-pop, Hyundai, Kia. It's a in a good way, it's a competitive market. And so that privileges the need to, as the Admiral said, sort of get in that game. Also, the Japanese American population is no longer the largest population. We've been looking at Vietnam. Vietnam has been the fastest growing trade partner with the United States, and also an incredibly rising place of U.S. foreign direct investment, not least because of the disruption of Chinese tariffs. But here's a little thing I found out the other day. Vietnam has emerged as the 6th largest sender of foreign students from Asia to the United States. We normalized relations, over in the last 20 years, of which it's really been able to move in the last, let's call it a decade. And it's moved that quickly. So we're talking about a very fluid, very competitive, very dynamic situation. And Japan, for all reasons that make it a wonderful success, stability, methodical, meticulous, careful, we're entering a different era. And so I think we need to think about how to adapt on our side and how we can help and work with our colleagues and friends in Japan to adapt from their side. And it needs to go both ways. There's no one fix.
You talked connections, you talked organizations, Satu, and I think those are really important to delve into grassroots diplomacy and to put our alliance through the perspective of friendship. So on that note, this question is asking, Japan being a country that has been in existence for centuries, what one or two things can America learn from their history and help grow our relationship and friendship?
Wow, I would have failed your exam.
I think the lesson of history that's sort of most recent is the one that I alluded to in my remarks. How the bitter enemies of one of the most savage wars of modern times managed to see common cause and work their way through that. So that's sort of in everybody's memory. If you go back and sort of look at the long span of Japan's history, the American interactions with it are quite interesting, starting with Commodore Perry's visit back in the 1850s and what Japan took away from that. I think the ugly chapter in U.S.-Japan relations that we need to keep in mind was not simply the one that everybody knows about of dropping the two atomic weapons, but the anti-Asian, anti-Japanese laws that we passed in the 1920s, the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, and I frankly am pretty proud of the way the United States is willing to face some of the ugly chapters in its history and reinterpret them and admit they were wrong. So I guess my answer to that question about history would be that the awareness of the full sweep of U.S.-Japan history, from close alliance to bitter enemies to discrimination and so on, is what ought to be in the background of Americans' thinking as they talk about the Japanese future. And we should make new mistakes. We should not make old mistakes.
That's right. I agree with that. And this is going to be the last question. I'm going to merge two questions together. One's very short. What is the new acronym, or what is the acronym for the new TPP? That's one. And then, if you assume that a new administration comes into office in D.C., officially in 2020 to 2021, should the new TPP be attempted once again? And if yes, how would you sell it to the U.S.?
Is that for me? Well, I tried this in the last presidential campaign. I'm working on one of the campaigns, and I did not succeed, as did my colleagues. The acronym is the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. Did I get that? I think that's right. Okay. Now, some of us proposed that it could be called, might have been called, the Trump-Pacific Partnership as well, which could have had a certain salience and salability. But anyway, we are here. Look, what I think is, and I'll tie it to the Admiral's wonderful point about immigration, because if you read the American naval historian William Braisted's 2 volumes, and I kid you not, there are 2 volumes, 1895 to 1907, 1907 to 27, about the U.S. Navy in the Pacific. The single first chapter begins with the issue of immigration with Japan, because Liz started us out wonderfully with the memory of Speakman in 42, but I'm conscious that it was just this summer, 120 years ago, that we voted on the Treaty of Paris to acquire the Philippines, with a great debate between Mark Twain and Teddy Roosevelt, and the building of the U.S. Navy subsequently. So things have a way of flowing upstream. And on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the U.S., for a country that its relative GDP is quite small related to trade. Relative GDP is quite small. Most of our GDP is accounted for by consumption and capital investment. I would just mention in this context, Japan is the number 2 or number 3 holder of our T-bills. So it finances a lot of our debt, a lot of our equity investment portfolio shares as well, not to mention the insurance sector. But I think we're in a period where any sale of a multilateral, high-standard trade agreement is really difficult. That as China's power rises and its integration with the region on economics deepens, America needs to deploy a full set of toolkits, including some other named multilateral agreement that would bring countries in the region together. And because we cannot have it purely confrontational with China, my political strategy would be this is very important for the reformers in China who might be attracted to an opportunity to join such an agreement. And there are people, I don't say they're the majority, but there are Chinese more reformist-minded, not in the current administration, who might be attracted to meeting those high standard obligations. And at a minimum, joining provisions or re-entering discussions would make countries that are sitting on the sidelines waiting for the US, Thailand, Indonesia, way down the road, India. But there are countries that are biding their time, waiting to see where things go. That's the political case we could make on TPP. That if we don't do it, we will be left behind. Will it work? I have no idea.
Yeah, I would just point out that the tide against multilateral trade agreements didn't take long to build, and so I don't think this is an unalterable political state in the United States. It could change the other way with a combination of circumstances, the right arguments, the right data, and you know, a lot of policy is like being a surfer out there waiting for the wave to come in. You got to be ready. You have to be prepared. You have to be prepared. You have to have a good plan. You have to know the big wave is coming when you see it, and then you go. And that's our job, I think.
It's all about timing.
Timing and preparation.
Timing and preparation.
That's right.
You can't take advantage of timing if you don't have a good board and good stand-up.
Thank you so much for joining us, Admiral and Satu.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Admiral Blair, Dr. Limaye. This evening, we were grateful again to our partners here at the Central Library, the Hennepin County Central Library, and the Friends of the Downtown Library, who are always our partner for these events. I noticed right at the end that our interim consul general from Chicago, Tanaka, came, and we're so thankful that you've come up to be part of this process this week. And for those of you who are members of Global Minnesota, thank you for your membership. You make these kinds of events, this kind of interaction and engagement possible. For you that are not members of Global Minnesota, tonight there's a special. If you sign up this evening, you get a free admittance to the Great Decisions program. This year it's focused on Mexico. We're having the ambassador from Mexico. She's new and she's a dynamic and an amazing leader, and a former U.S. ambassador to Mexico, a Minnesotan. So that's on October 4th, and that's part of the package this evening. If you want to sign up for membership, you can do it out back. There's food and appetizers and things way in the back outside, and so we'll have time to discuss with each other and perhaps ask some more questions and be able to share more of this experience this evening before we say goodnight. Thank you again. Thank you again.